He was born in the small town of Indiana, Pennsylvania, 6 months before Orville Wright demonstrated the Wright Flyer at Fort Myer near Washington, D.C. Fascinated by magic tricks and crystal radios as a boy, his life was changed forever after he spent $15 to buy a flight with a barnstormer. From that point on, aviation was his passion. He became famous for his acting on Broadway and in Hollywood. His public image was that of a modest, gangling, somewhat shy man. But the private persona believed in hard work, responsibility, and personal excellence. When the draft began in 1940, this Hollywood star tossed aside his career and enlisted in the Army. With the outbreak of the Second World War, he fought to enter combat and rose through the ranks from private to brigadier general, earning respect as commander of a B-24 squadron. 3 times he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and twice the Croix de Guerre. He helped campaign to create the Air Force and regarded his military service as the most important thing he ever accomplished. He was known to the world as Jimmy Stewart, but he was also Brigadier General James Maitland Stewart, United States Air Force, and he is a legend of Airpower. Jimmy Stewart was born on May 20th, 1908, the only son of Alex, proprietor of the J.M. Stewart & Company hardware store, and Bessie, an organist at the local Presbyterian church. He discovered his fascination with aviation about the same time as the rest of the country. Many pilots returning from World War I found themselves without work and making their living with war surplus airplanes, barnstorming across the country. One of them landed in a farmer's field near Jimmy's hometown. Despite the fears of his parents, Stewart bought his 15-minute flight for $15 and went flying, while his father sat below in the family car, engine running, ready to help in the event of a crash. He landed a changed person.
Barnstorming pilots were very popular in the 20s, and a pilot did land outside of town, and he pestered his father to go up in the plane, and his father didn't want him to, and he scraped together the money, and his father did allow it. However, a good friend of the family, Dr. Torrance, also went along for the ride, and that was Jimmy's first taste of flying.
From that point on, Stewart kept a scrapbook with clippings of major aviation events. One such event was the flight of Charles Lindbergh 10 years later. In fact, his cross-Atlantic flight occurred on Stewart's 19th birthday. Excited by this historic flight, Jimmy placed a model of Lindbergh's Spirit of St. Louis airplane in the window of the Stewart hardware store, which was kept lit at night. A wire attached to a round board suspended the model between a drawing of the Woolworth Building in New York and the Eiffel Tower in Paris. As wire reports from the Indiana Evening Gazette across the street spelled out Lindbergh's progress, Jimmy dutifully ran back to the hardware store to move the model, letting the rest of the town know how Lindy was doing.
Oh, he was crazy about flying. There's a little book called How to Fly an Airplane. It's about ½ inch thick in red leatherette. And the first 14 pages are the history of flying. Then after that, they get into how to fly an airplane. And Jim pored over that book.
Flying would be a lifelong passion for Stewart. Years later, sitting on movie sets between takes, he could be found curled up with a flying magazine. But it would be quite some time before Jimmy would climb into the cockpit himself. After graduating from Princeton in 1932, he embarked on an acting career that eventually landed him in Hollywood as an up-and-coming star. Now being paid for his talents, Stewart used the money to finance his childhood dream, learning to fly. Within a year, he would be flying his own plane. In less than 10 years, he would be commanding his own squadron of bombers. By 1936, Stewart had logged several hundred hours of flying and owned a 3-passenger Stinson HW-75. As predicted, he used it to escape the glare of press agents and the pressure of making as many as 6 films a year. But Jimmy always found time for family and friends.
He was always Jim Stewart. He'd come home and be just the same as he was. You'd have no idea that he was a famous man. And he was unfailingly kind.
He would fly home after he bought his first airplane. He did fly home to Indiana, Pennsylvania to visit his parents, and I understand that he would follow the train tracks.
Deutschland und hinter uns kommt Deutschland! 1936 was also the year a European politician named Adolf Hitler hosted the Olympic Games in Berlin. Hitler used the Games to showcase his National Socialist Party and intended they would also flaunt Aryanism and his serious rebuilding of Germany's military strength. Back in the United States, most Americans only knew about the Games and Hitler from what they saw in the newsreels at the movies. But Hitler was being noticed by American military leaders. The rise of the Luftwaffe began ringing alarms with American Army commanders like General Henry Hap Arnold. In 1936, the United States ranked only 7th in air power, flying a limited number of obsolete trainers from a single training base. The only bombers that existed were twin-engine, medium-range aircraft, totally unsuited for anything but a defensive battle. Arnold, faced with tight budgets and a Congress reluctant to invest in new aircraft, pushed civilians to begin building airstrips and learning how to fly. Stewart was anxious to help. Southwest Airlines was one of the companies that pledged to train pilots for the military effort, and Jimmy invested in the program. The result was some 80 new flyers. But it pointed Jimmy Stewart at something far more serious than his film career. He was one of Hollywood's most eligible bachelors, and he was a star in the film industry.
When Jimmy Stewart was first in Hollywood, it must have been a magical time. Hollywood in the 1930s, he was single, good-looking, acted in films with a lot of the really popular stars of the day. Joan Crawford, Ginger Rogers, dated, and really was a bachelor about town.
But Stewart wondered if it wasn't just a bit frivolous and unimportant. It looked like there was a war coming, and Jimmy wanted to do his part. Congress passed the draft September 16, 1940, calling for nearly 1 million men between the ages of 20 and 36. Much to the horror of the studio bosses, Jimmy Stewart announced he was going to enlist, referring to his draft notice as the only lottery I ever won. He wanted to fly, and despite an early ambition to attend the Naval Academy, he signed up with the Army and went to take his physical. He failed. He was 10 pounds underweight. Stewart was furious. He played football at his weight and felt that he had a responsibility to serve his country. If the Army wanted him to weigh more, he'd simply go on a binge.
When Jimmy Stewart first went to take his physical for induction into the Army, he failed the weight test. He was underweight and was below the limit acceptable by Army standards. He thought the whole idea was ridiculous, that he couldn't serve his country because he was underweight. He did go back and take the test again, and this time the Army looked the other way, and Jimmy Stewart entered the Army.
Jimmy Stewart passed the weight requirement by 1 ounce and ran out to a waiting friend shouting, "I'm in, I'm in." He reported for duty at Moffett Field, California on March 22, 1941, despite the protests of MGM studio boss Louis B. Mayer. Hollywood leading man Jimmy Stewart became Private James Stewart, U.S. Army.
The studio Jimmy Stewart was with at the time he wanted to enlist in the Army was MGM. And MGM was not happy with his idea to enlist. But Jimmy Stewart came from a very patriotic family. He had a long line of ancestors who had served in military service. Stewart had fought in every American war since the Revolution.
But he was no ordinary buck private, having taken a $5,979 monthly pay cut to be there. He was Jimmy Stewart, the Academy Award-winning actor, The man who'd kissed some of the most beautiful women on Hollywood's silver screen. And inevitably, he drew attention. The biggest help, sir, he said, would be no publicity, no interviews, no publicity stunts, no radio interviews, Jimmy told Colonel George Usher, his commanding officer at Moffett Field. But Colonel Usher knew the determined actor turned private was there for a reason. He wanted to fly.
Jimmy Stewart entered the Army hoping to fly and become part of the Army Air Corps. He did have over 100 hours of air time before he went into the Army. Knowing that he would have to pass a very stiff proficiency test, he actually paid for an additional 100 or so hours of flying time so that he would be able to pass that test.
Urged into Army Air Corps extension training by his understanding commander, Stewart persevered. And in November of 1941, he completed flight training. But his commission was not immediate, and he was sent back to Moffett Field while the military bureaucracy processed his papers. And then, on December 7th, 1941.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
America declared war on Japan, and the need for pilots grew greater than ever. On January 19, 1942, just over 1 month after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Corporal Jimmy Stewart jumped to the officer ranks, receiving his commission as a second lieutenant, and most importantly, his pilot's wings. He was immediately ordered to active duty and transferred to Kirkland Field, New Mexico, where he trained as a bomber pilot and became an instructor. There, the newly promoted first lieutenant set his sights on combat, unconvinced of the argument that helping on the home front was just as important as being in the thick of battle. What's wrong with wanting to fight for your country, he once asked. Why are people embarrassed to use the word patriotism? But Stewart would get his wish, or at least he thought so at the time. After convincing his commanding officer to send him to bomber training, he emerged as a fully qualified B-17 bomber commander. The stage was set for Stewart to go overseas when he ran into an unforeseen snag. Awaiting final orders in Salt Lake City, his commanding officer delivered the bad news. There must be some hitch about your going into combat, he said. I've got orders to classify you as static personnel. That meant Jimmy wasn't going overseas, at least for the time being.
There were people within the Army powers that be that weren't crazy about sending a famous movie star off to combat and perhaps running the risk of him being lost in the war. So they did their best to keep him grounded.
Instead, Lieutenant Stewart was assigned as an instructor pilot at Gowan Field in Boise, Idaho. Heartbroken but strong, he never uttered a word of discontent and reported as ordered for duty. Instructing at Gowan Field wasn't combat, but it was grueling work. Orders from above came to churn out the flight crews. Instructors flew round-the-clock missions to keep up with the demand, and Stewart grew weary from the constant pressure to deliver qualified pilots. Now a captain, he longed for an overseas assignment and the chance to fight the enemy. Fortunately, he wouldn't remain an instructor for long. His commanding officer heard his requests and arranged a transfer to the 445th Bombardment Group in Sioux City, Iowa. The 445th was scheduled to go overseas and needed a squadron operations officer. Jimmy reported for duty and immediately impressed his superiors. In just 19 days, he was promoted to commander of a B-24 bomber squadron. He was finally headed for combat.
When Jimmy Stewart was about to fly out of Sioux City, Iowa, his parents both visited him, and his father did slip him a note that Jimmy didn't read right away. And within the note was also the 91st Psalm, and it was a prayer that Jimmy Stewart carried with him throughout the war and referred to on a number of occasions.
Captain Jimmy Stewart, B-24 Squadron Commander, arrived in England during the latter part of 1943. During his tour of duty, he flew 20 combat missions over the German cities of Bremen, Frankfurt, and Berlin, to name a few. Hundreds of bombers were lost during those missions, but Stewart's calm command style held his squadron together, earning him accolades from peers and superiors alike. Serving with distinction, he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross with 2 oak leaf clusters, the Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters, France's Croix de Guerre with palm, and emerged from the war as a colonel in command of the bomber wing he served for so long. Colonel Ramsey Potts was honored to present Jimmy Stewart with the Distinguished Flying Cross.
8th Air Force lost over 6,000 airplane bombers and during the campaign, and we had over 50,000 casualties. He led a number of very difficult missions, including one to Berlin, and it may well have been that DFC was awarded to him because of his leadership on one of those very difficult missions.
Jimmy Stewart was a talented flyer, and beyond that, he was a leader. The men, you know, he could have been hated in his outfit. Just think about it. Here's a movie star, guy with tremendous amount of income, could walk at any time. He could have walked from his task. He didn't demand special duties. He didn't demand special promotions. He was in the ranks, went up, made his way on his own. Tremendous leader.
Stewart returned to America in September of 1945, noticeably grayer, but nonetheless the same gangly, modest, and somewhat shy man he always had been. True to his nature, he refused to let the MGM studio bosses use his war record to promote his movie career, instead electing to quietly leave active duty for the Air Corps Reserve. But this would not be the end of Jimmy Stewart's military career.
When Jimmy Stewart returned from World War II, he was a colonel. He had gone in as a private and rose to the rank of colonel by the end of the war. He went back to Hollywood without a contract. MGM did not renew his contract, and he worked without a contract for a number of years, actually. One condition that he did have written into a contract was that they could not use his war record to promote a film. He did not want to be known as a war hero.
1946 was a busy year for the actor turned war hero. His first movie after World War II was Frank Capra's holiday classic, It's a Wonderful Life, for which he received an Academy Award nomination. He also found time that year to help establish the Air Force Association, a lobbying organization aimed at turning the Army Air Corps into a separate military branch. Stewart was elected National Vice President and was one of 6 board members to meet with President Truman on Air Force matters. The following year, President Truman signed the National Security Act, authorizing creation of the United States Air Force. Jimmy Stewart was proud to be a member of this new service, pledging his support as a reserve officer, board member of the Air Force Association, and as the master of ceremonies for Air Force awareness events such as Wing Ding 48.
James, I know that there are very few people can do it this way, but you have the talent. Usually people finish with a song or a dance. They do something. Don't you do anything?
Oh, you see, I don't have to do anything. I'm a colonel.
Now in his early 40s, with World War II over and having been established as one of Hollywood's most acclaimed actors, Jimmy Stewart felt the need to settle down. In 1948, Jimmy met Gloria Hattrick McLean at a dinner party hosted by fellow Hollywood screen star Gary Cooper. Their romance quickly flourished, and a year later, they were married.
She was very high style, very sophisticated. And Jim wasn't, but he thought she was beautiful and wonderful, adored her, just absolutely adored her.
Gloria had 2 young sons from a previous marriage, Ronald, age 5, and Michael, age 3. But to Jimmy, that just meant more family.
I don't think Jimmy Stewart ever felt that he was anything less than a father to both Ronald and Michael. They were very young when he married their mother, and they were his boys, and he was their dad, and they called him Dad. I don't think he ever looked upon them as stepsons. They were his sons.
2 years later, Jimmy and Gloria added twin girls to the family. A devoted father and husband, he found a way to bridge the time among family, a film career, and the Air Force Reserve. He was still fascinated by military air power, taking time out of his busy schedule to visit airmen abroad during the Korean War. Recognized for his continued achievements by the Air Force, he was promoted to Brigadier General in 1959, a post he would hold until his retirement in 1968. By the 1960s, the next generation of Stewarts was serving in the military. Gloria's son, Ronald McLean, was in Vietnam, serving a tour of duty as a Marine officer. Jimmy and Gloria pledged their support by visiting him as part of a goodwill tour. Unfortunately, it would be the last time they would ever see their son.
In the spring of 1969, Jimmy and Gloria Stewart went on a goodwill tour of Vietnam. They met up with their son, Ron, and enjoyed their visit with him and met a lot of his friends and visited with a number of military personnel. Tragically, about 3 months later, in June of 1969, Ronald was killed, which devastated them both.
When Ronald was killed in the war, he may have mourned privately, but he did not seem to be mourning because he said he died in the service of his country, and you can't ask for anybody to do more than that. But Gloria mourned. She never got over that losing that boy.
But the shy, modest war hero from Indiana, Pennsylvania was proud of Ronald. And just like the bomber pilots he served with who never returned, Stewart knew his son had died with honor. He would never forget the brave men and women who risked and sometimes lost their lives for their country. He always held the military in high esteem and once told an Aerospace Education Foundation audience, "My service in the military has made me a better citizen, and for that I am grateful to the United States Air Force." The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences held him in high esteem too, awarding him an honorary Oscar in 1985 for his 5 decades in Hollywood. His star is a fixture along Hollywood's Walk of Fame, and in his hometown of Indiana, Pennsylvania, stands the Jimmy Stewart Museum, a collection of exhibits on his life as both an aviator and a celebrity. But Jimmy Stewart regarded his duty to the United States as his most important achievement. He will be remembered by many as an accomplished actor, a Hollywood statesman, and most importantly, a decorated war hero. His name is James Maitland Stewart, and he is a legend of air power.